Hello, for Lesson 2, you will be required to read Chapter 2 in the St. Martin's Guide, which will prepare you to write a narrative essay about your own life. As I mentioned in the welcome video, the narrative essay uniquely allows you to explore a creative freedom that just doesn't exist with the other essays that you'll be writing this semester, so I encourage you to have fun with this assignment and really push the creative boundaries you may have set for yourself. For this week's assignment, you'll be required to write a 2 to 3 page essay about one specific event in your life that has directly impacted your personal testimony or your religious beliefs. If you are taking notes, which I highly encourage, be sure to write down that you are only writing about one event. Think about the limited space you have. You will not have room to share your entire testimony. You'll need to focus your story to be clear and concise. In order to talk about the narrative essay's main components, I'll be referencing Lee Martin's short nonfiction piece titled Snow. Please download that Word document. It's the first file in our current lesson, if you haven't already found it, and follow along as I read it now. Here we go. Snow by Lee Martin. Once when I was 5, a snowstorm came overnight and lingered into the morning. We lived on the farm then, and for some reason I can't recall, my mother and father set out up on the lane in my father's Chevrolet pickup, leaving me in the care of my grandmother. I dragged a ladder chair to the front door and stood on it so I'd be tall enough to look out the glass. I watched the back end of the truck slide a little in the deep snow before finding purchase and going on. My father turned onto the county line road, and I was still watching when the truck, nearly to the crossroads, slid into the ditch. I still remember the sight of my parents walking back up the lane, heads bent against the force of the snow, my mother's scarf tied beneath her chin, the skirt of her dress flapping around her legs, the bill of my father's cap dusted with snow, his cheeks red from the cold. Although I didn't know it then, this must have been one of the first times when I sensed that my parents lived inside imperfect bodies. They'd tried to move through space and failed. I didn't know, as I felt the cold they carried back into our home, that this was only one of their many rehearsals for leaving this world. Now I think of their footprints in the lane, proof that they once walked upon this earth, those footprints disappearing even as I celebrated my parents' return, all sign of them filling in with snow. Now that we've read Snow, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is the point of view we'll be using for the narrative essay. This paper will be the only paper this semester in which you are completely free to use first person. The reason why you're allowed to use the word I for this assignment specifically is because you are sharing a story about your life from your point of view. One of the purposes of this essay is to celebrate the work that God has done in your life. Psalm 64:9 states that we should declare the work of God and that we should wisely consider God's doings. The narrative essay is one of my favorite assignments because it encourages all of us to reflect on the goodness and faithfulness of God in our lives. It also pushes us to share our testimony with others. That's another reason why I allow you to write in the first person, because it's my hope that you will share this paper with others and that by writing in first person, your readers will be able to empathize or even identify with your story. As we study Lee Martin's Snow, it's amazing that just as the speaker peers out of the window to view his parents, we, the readers, are also given an opportunity to look through a small window into Martin's life. Through that window, we see a 5-year-old child, a son, a spectator, and an adult who processes some harsh images concerning his parents' mortality. I mention this because it takes courage and vulnerability to invite people into our space and into our memories, especially when those people are strangers. While researching the first person point of view, I found a funny quote online by Jasper Freud, who states, I would so hate to be a first person character, always on your guard, always having people read your thoughts. Just to be clear, I will be the only person who reads your narrative essay, and I want you to know that I consider that a privilege, but I also don't pretend that that makes it any easier. And people obviously have different comfort levels. You might be the type of person who wears their heart on their sleeve, but at the end of the day, I want you to pick a story from your life that you feel comfortable sharing. And I also want to encourage you to remember that as Christians, our point of view always points back to God. We may be using first person, our essays might be riddled with capital I's, but the true star of the show is our Lord. So let this paper be an act of worship. Now that we've talked about point of view, I want to transition and talk about the elements of a well-told story. Remember, for this assignment, I want you to detail one specific event. Again, the reason that I want you to narrow your scope is because this essay is only 2 to 3 pages, and a lot of students struggle to write within certain page parameters, whether they're asked to write a 2-page essay or a 10-page essay. It takes great skill to not go over or under, and that's always the challenge. And the reason why I included Lee Martin's work is because he's incredibly intentional with the small space he uses. His essay may be short, but it's also intense and powerful. And that's because he doesn't take on too much. His event probably occurs within a 10-minute time frame. Your story doesn't have to be limited to 10 minutes, but just be aware of the time you're using. The next element of a well told story is dramatic conflict. Now, don't be intimidated by the word dramatic. I myself have lived a pretty drama free life, but that doesn't mean that I haven't seen God move in big ways. I challenge you to think outside of the box. Martin's story, in a lot of ways, is remarkably simple. His narrative is about a boy who sees his parents fail and struggle to walk home. And in the end, Martin compares what he knows now as an adult to what he only sensed as a child. In a similar fashion, I'd like you to think about the way you've grown. How has God renewed your mind? How has He changed the way you look at Him, at yourself, or maybe other people in your life? As you begin the writing process, you might find it helpful to familiarize yourself with the common story arc. You can even use it during the pre-writing phase of your writing process to help you organize your life event. Notice the story arc has 5 main parts, but you do not need to highlight each of these elements equally. For example, the best short stories hook their readers immediately. Lee Martin could have described the snowstorm in detail or talked about length about farm life, but ultimately he decided that he didn't want to draw too much attention to his background information because his focus was literally on his parents. And that's why I recommend that you jump right into your narrative, unless, of course, it would serve your story well if you did otherwise. As for the rising action, students have shared about a variety of conflicts in their lives. One student shared about finding out that he had a brain tumor. Another student talked about getting baptized and being nervous about that decision. Another student wrote a compelling story about how she lost her pet bird as a child. Truly, you can talk about anything. And after your story reaches its climax and the tension subsides, you should begin to share what this event has taught you about God. As your story resolves, don't feel pressured to tie your story up in a bow. It's okay if you still have unresolved thoughts and feelings concerning the life event that you'll be addressing. Simply be honest about your current condition. We're all works in progress. Another key aspect about telling a well told story is actually remembering what happened. And if you have a memory like mine, that can be a real challenge. But take comfort because you don't have to remember everything. Let's remove that pressure right now. You simply have to be able to reconstruct enough of the story that you're able to provide vivid detail to make your story dramatic and to create a dominant impression. And if you can't remember a specific detail, you're free to follow Lee Martin's example and admit it. He shares, "We lived on the farm then, and for some reason I can't recall, my mother and father set out up the lane in my father's Chevrolet pickup, leaving me in the care of my grandmother." Forgetting is a part of being human. Now that we've finished talking about the elements of a well-told story, let's move on to vivid descriptions of people and places. In order to help your readers feel as if they have been teleported into your story, it will be important for you to create vivid descriptions of the people and/or places in your story. This is the second basic feature of the narrative essay. Therefore, you want to be specific and consider the small details. Perhaps you'll want to emphasize how the people in your story look, dress, and/or speak. Maybe you'll want to highlight certain objects in your narrative by detailing their color, shape, size, and/or texture. Either way, you should attempt to engage your readers' five senses, help them to smell the steaming waffles on your kitchen table, help them to hear the dull hum of a ceiling fan. But again, I want you to remember that you can't describe everything. Prioritize the descriptions that will enhance the dominant impression you are trying to create for your readers. You might be wondering, what is a dominant impression? Well, it's a mood or an atmosphere that reinforces the writer's purpose. And as a writer, you'll depend on your details to shape that impression. So let's take a closer look at the details Martin includes. Now, we aren't in Lee Martin's mind, so we can't fully know his purpose or the dominant impression that he was trying to create, but we can pay attention to the details he provides and the details he leaves out. For instance, we don't know his parents or his grandmother's names, ages, ethnicities, their height or weight or religious beliefs. All he wants his readers to know is that he has parents, and when they went on their errand in a Chevrolet pickup, he does include that detail, that he was left with his grandma. As far as setting goes, Martin reveals that he grew up on a farm, but we don't know the size of that farm, we don't know what types of animals his family had, but we do know that at the time of the event there was a snowstorm that had begun the previous evening, and Martin flies through these details rather quickly. The first time he slows down to give his readers a more in-depth description is when he moves the chair to the front door to watch his parents drive away. Now, this is where our critical reading skills from Lesson 1 come into play. As you read through Snow and the other narrative essays, you want to be mindful of the decisions that are being made. Remember, you're not only paying attention to the message, but you're also focusing on the manner or how the message is being conveyed. And I think the detail of the chair highlights the narrator's age, but specifically the mindset of a child. Right now, my husband is working from home. His office is the kitchen table. So when he has to take a phone call, he goes out into the backyard to get some privacy. And my little 10-month-old gets so excited when she can see him through the window. Immediately, her little pointer finger goes up and she points to her dad while exclaiming, "Dada." And now I don't know if you still live at home with your parents, but I'm sure you've long grown out of the phase where you watch your parents drive away. But this is very typical behavior for a small child who's attached to their parents. A lot of children experience some sort of separation anxiety at one point in their lives because there is a special bond between parents and children. An even greater level of attention is given when Martin sees his parents drive away. There's some foreshadowing when the truck's back end slides a little, and we aren't surprised when Martin's father loses control after he turns onto County Line Road. There's another small specific detail and ultimately slides into a ditch. And what I want to emphasize here is that, again, your dominant impression will be influenced by the details you include and the details you leave out. And even beyond that, both details, great and small, will have an impact on your story. Even the smallest details, like the Chevrolet pickup, make the story that more human because it's been tailored to fit the author's life. So pay attention to the creative choices you make. Here we have an example of a great detail. As we reach the climax of Martin's story, we're given a very vivid description. And if we're looking through his details through the lens of the five senses, Martin clearly depends on sight. He even states, "I still remember the sight." I'm going to stop here to highlight that Martin points out that he still remembers. The still remember should also tip us off that what he's about to tell us is important, since earlier in his essay he mentions that he couldn't remember why his parents left in the first place. This forgetting and then remembering shows us how his mind has prioritized his memories at the very least. But going back to the quote on this slide, we see two parents who can't even walk upright because they're being pelted by this snowstorm. We get the detail that his mother was wearing a scarf, her dress flaps in the wind, the dad's cap is dusted with snow, and his dad's has red cheeks because it's so cold, and these details are leading us to the significance of this event. But before we move on to the next thing, I want to explore one more of the five senses with you, and that's touch. Martin states, I didn't know as I felt the cold they carried back into our home that this was only one of their many rehearsals for leaving this world. In this description, it would seem that Martin's parents are carrying the cold like they would carry a package or some kind of object that could be passed from one person to another, and that makes this description all the more real for his readers. While we're at it, I'll also mention that Martin uses a metaphor here. He compares his parents' accident to a rehearsal for death. As we learned in Lesson 1, another way to create vivid images is by using metaphors and similes. Here are two examples from this week's readings. Trey Ellis states, moving from our modest 3-bedroom in suburban Connecticut to a majestic pre-war on the corner of West 81st Street and Riverside Drive made me feel like George Jefferson in the television comedy series The Jeffersons. By using this simile, Ellis helps his readers understand that he felt enriched and enlivened by his new living conditions. And in the next example, Annie Dillard states the cars traveled Reynolds Street slowly and evenly. They were targets all but wrapped in red ribbons, cream puffs. By using this metaphor, Dillard shows her readers how enticing those cars appeared to her and her friends. They couldn't let a car pass without nailing it with a perfectly formed snowball. For your narrative essay, you are also required to include at least one piece of dramatized dialogue. For those of you who don't know, dramatized dialogue reconstructs what was said. Let's look at an example of dramatized dialogue from Annie Dillard's An American Childhood, since there is an example in Lee Martin's Snow. If you haven't read this narrative already, Dillard shares about a time in her life when she and her friend were chased by an adult stranger. In her nonfiction piece, she states, it was a long time before he could speak. I had some difficulty at first recalling why we were there. My lips felt swollen. I couldn't see out of the sides of my eyes. I kept coughing. You stupid kids, he began perfunctorily. We listened perfunctorily indeed, if we listened at all. Notice that this is the only piece of dramatized dialogue in Dillard's story. I point this out because you do not need to reconstruct every conversation that was had during the event in your life that you'll be sharing about. Again, the dialogue you include should be intentionally chosen to reinforce your dominant impression. This means that the majority of your dialogue will be summarized. In her essay called Calling Home, Jean Brandt states, 2 officers arrived and placed me under arrest. They said that I was to be taken to the police station. Notice that Brandt does not provide the police officers exact words or use quotation marks. She merely provides the gist of what was said. And let me give you one more tip. Write how people talk, aka quote unquote proper English, goes out the window when you're writing dialogue. Just be honest or it won't seem realistic. The last basic feature of the narrative essay we need to discuss is autobiographical significance. As mentioned, each of your stories will center on some kind of conflict. Ultimately, your essay should reveal how the conflict in your life impacted your personal testimony or religious beliefs. And you'll accomplish this by using a combination of showing and telling. In other words, you'll need to investigate what your conflict taught you about God and then share your findings, meaning that you'll need to explore the thoughts and feelings you experienced from the time the event took place, and you'll also need to reflect on your current perspective. On page 46 in your textbook, there is a helpful exercise where you can use two columns to explore the autobiographical significance of your story. The column on your left will be used to write down your feelings and thoughts while you are actually living through the event you'll be addressing, and the column on your right will hold your present perspective. If Lee Martin were to make a chart like this one, I think he'd classify his thoughts and feelings like this. On the left, he'd put, although I didn't know it then, this must have been one of the first times when I sensed that my parents lived inside imperfect bodies. And on the right, he'd put, I didn't know as I felt the cold they carried back into our home that this was only one of their many rehearsals for leaving this world. The meat of this story is that a young boy witnesses his parents get into a car accident and then stumble home. Although Martin doesn't tell us how this event specifically affected him as a child, we know that this memory has left a footprint in his mind. As a 5-year-old, Martin couldn't understand the significance of this event. He merely sensed for the first time that his parents, as he said, lived in imperfect bodies. And what do imperfect bodies do? Well, they die. And as I mentioned, this car accident was like a rehearsal for death. But there would come a time where Martin's parents wouldn't make it back home to him. Just like their footprints that disappeared in the snow, their lives would be short lived. Life is a vapor. That's what the Bible tells us. With that truth in mind, I ask you to read Martin's piece many times over this week. Pay attention to his details. Think about how they contribute to this major life lesson. Now that we've finished talking about the narrative essay's major components, I want to leave you with a few final tips. One thing you want to avoid while writing your narrative essay is the use of cliches. Unless strategically placed, a cliche will cheapen your writing by making your writing less interesting and more generic. To show you what I mean, I've included a few examples from Jean Brandt's essay Calling Home. We have There was no turning back, what was done, my heart began to race, I heaved a sigh of relief, my heart raced, a large knot formed in my stomach. Instead of using cliches like these, be more imaginative. Maybe you felt like a mouse in a maze, or maybe you encountered a problem that felt like a fatty piece of meat. No matter how hard you chewed, it couldn't be swallowed. Okay, that's a pretty gross simile, but maybe that's the point. You want to paint a picture your readers will remember, even if it's a bit awkward. To drive home this idea even further, I will read you 3 different descriptions. Think about which you prefer. Number 1, I saw my parents a few yards away and my heart raced. 2, this man was gaining on us. He was a thin man, all action. All of a sudden, we were running for our lives. Or 3, it wasn't until my father opened the door that I realized something terrifyingly life altering was about to be revealed. The reason the first example does not work as well as the second and third examples is because Brandt's wording could be copied and pasted into any story. Although readers may understand what a racing heart feels like, the cliche makes the story less personalized and more generic. You want your narrative essay to stand out. God has given each of you a unique testimony. Use your essay to celebrate those differences and to demonstrate to others what a personal and intimate God we serve. Now that I've addressed the major components of the narrative essay, I want to provide a list of criteria that will help you choose your event. Again, your event should directly impact your personal testimony or religious beliefs, take place over a short period of time, preferably just a few hours, center on conflict, disclose something significant about your life, allow you to portray yourself in a way that you feel comfortable sharing with your instructor and classmates, reveal complex or ambivalent feelings, lead readers to think about their own experience. After you've chosen the event you'll be writing on, I suggest that you use the story arc to map out the basic elements of your story. Once your story arc is complete, I recommend writing a discovery draft. Remember that I talked about the discovery draft in the class's welcome video. Basically, all you need to do is write continuously for 5 to 10 minutes without putting your pen down. And without worrying about sentence structure or grammar, you are simply getting those brain juices flowing. And even though you will never be required to turn in any pre-writing activities or outlines except for the argumentative essay, I can guarantee you that they will make your writing better. They may feel like they're natural at first, and they may even feel like a waste of time, but I am convinced that you will ultimately find them valuable and rewarding. And as this slide states, writing is a process. Just like a movie, some scenes will require several takes. One final overlooked aspect of the narrative essay is the essay's title. Do not use the narrative essay to introduce your one-of-a-kind testimony. Think of something creative. To conclude Lesson 2, I want to highlight how to troubleshoot your draft. See the chart in your textbook on page 54. I've also listed some of the helpful questions from the St. Martin Guide that you can ask yourself after you've finished drafting. For instance, does my story start too slowly? Is the chronology confusing? Does the conflict effectively connect to the significance? Are the places easy to visualize? Do the people come alive? Will it be easy for readers to identify/empathize with the writer? Does the significance seem too pat or simplistic? And that's all we have for Lesson 2. If you have any questions or concerns about this assignment, please reach out. I'm here to help. Finally, I pray that you'd be blessed as you think about all the times in your life God has shown up, although truly He is always with us. Happy writing, everyone.